they said the fire began in the west wing, a careless spark from a servant's lantern. But I remember the way it spread, too precise to be an accident, too silent to be mercy. The marble turned red in the reflection, and the gold leaf ceilings cracked like old promises. I stood on the terrace in my wedding attire, the scent of sandalwood and smoke mixing in the night air, watching the palace that had raised me collapse into flame. Beside me, my husband smiled. And I understood, the fire wasn't meant to destroy the palace. It was meant to erase me. Before we continue, if stories of love, betrayal, and the fragile beauty of power move you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you think, and every story like this one deserves to be remembered. They woke me before dawn, before the muezzin's call, before the first bird broke the silence. The maid spoke in whispers as they draped me in silk, layering white and gold until I could barely move. My hands trembled beneath the weight of the bangles. Outside, the palace shimmered in preparations, elephants painted, musicians tuning their instruments, courtiers pacing with veiled urgency. It was supposed to be the happiest morning of my life, and yet, when I looked into the mirror, I saw a stranger, a girl dressed as an offering. My father entered without knocking. His beard had more silver than I remembered. He smiled, but his eyes avoided mine. "You look like your mother," he said, and for a moment, that almost made me proud. She had died giving birth to me, a story often repeated like a prayer, both a blessing and a curse. He adjusted the edge of my dupatta and added softly, "Today, our family becomes eternal." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. The marriage wasn't just between me and the prince, it was between his empire and our bloodline. I was a bridge, not a bride. The procession began as the sun rose over the Yamuna. Bells, chants, and the sweet heaviness of rosewater filled the air. My groom waited in the marble pavilion, his face calm, unreadable. Prince Azhar, beloved by the empire, feared by his enemies. He looked at me as one might look at a trophy, with admiration, but no affection. When he took my hand, his touch was cool, deliberate. "From this day," he said, "our fates are bound." The crowd cheered. I smiled as I was taught. But something in his tone, too polished, too final, made the air inside my chest thin. That evening, as musicians played in the gardens and torches glowed like stars trapped in glass, I wandered to the balcony overlooking the city. The river reflected the light in rippling gold. I should have felt joy. Instead, I felt distance. The palace, the guests, the jewels, everything seemed borrowed. The laughter from below echoed up the marble walls like a haunting refrain. Azhar joined me, silent for a long time. Then, he said, "You're quiet for a bride." "Perhaps I'm listening," I replied. "To what?" "To the sound of promises being made and broken in the same breath." He smiled faintly, though his eyes didn't. "You'll learn to speak more softly in this palace." I turned to him, the wind carrying the scent of jasmine and smoke. "And you'll learn that silence isn't the same as obedience." That night, I lay awake in the bridal chamber, the world still buzzing with celebration. The moonlight painted the floor in silver. Somewhere far below, I heard the creak of a gate closing. A chill passed through me, not from the air, but from intuition. I had entered my new home not as a queen, but as a pawn. And though I didn't yet know it, every flame that would one day consume this place had already been lit, quietly, beneath the silks and the songs. The mornings in the palace were choreographed like rituals. Servants appeared and vanished like ghosts, bearing trays of fruit, jugs of milk, folded letters sealed in wax. Every corridor smelled of rosewater and politics. Within days, I learned that every smile carried a motive, every silence a secret. Prince Azhar kept his distance. Our conversations were polite, measured, the kind that could be repeated before an audience without consequence. He called me Begum, never by name. At first, I thought it was formality. Later, I understood it was distance disguised as respect. When I spoke of plans for the orphan girl's education my family supported, he listened absently, his eyes tracing the patterns on the carpet rather than my words. At meals, he would mention trade, borders, alliances. Not love. Not dreams. Not me. His mother, the Dowager Queen, spoke to me in riddles. A woman's worth, she once said as we arranged flowers in a silver vase, is measured not by her beauty, but by how quietly she bears disappointment. I smiled, because that's what they expected. But her words left a taste of iron in my mouth. It was during the 3rd week of marriage that I began to notice the ledgers, thick, leather-bound books locked in a drawer of Azhar's study. I had never entered that room uninvited. It smelled of ink and sandalwood, the curtains always drawn. One afternoon, while he attended a council meeting, curiosity became courage. Or perhaps, desperation. I unlocked the drawer with a hairpin. Inside lay rows of entries, not of expenses, but of transactions. Land titles. Servant names. Gold transferred in exchange for signatures I recognized, my father's, among them. My breath caught. The ink was still fresh on the last page, the deed to our ancestral estate, transferred to the crown as part of the dowry agreement. It wasn't a gift. It was a sale. That evening, I confronted Azhar gently, careful not to sound accusatory. I didn't realize the dowry included my father's estate. He didn't even look up from his wine. It was discussed, he said. Perhaps your father spared you the tedium of negotiation. Negotiation? I whispered. You call it that? He set the cup down, eyes sharp now. You are a queen, not a clerk. Some matters are better left unseen. His words cut more deeply than he knew. That night, I went to my father's quarters, only to find his belongings gone. A guard at the door told me he had departed for Lahore, suddenly, without farewell. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, tracing the henna fading from my hands, wondering when exactly I had stopped being a daughter and become property. The palace lanterns flickered against the courtyard walls like restless souls. The next day, Azhar gifted me a necklace, rubies, heavy and flawless. For you, he said, fastening it around my neck. A reminder of loyalty. His fingers brushed my skin, and though he smiled, I saw it clearly now, that shadow behind the charm, that hunger for control. I nodded, masking the tremor in my hands. It's beautiful, I said. Good, he murmured. Then wear it always. I did. But every time the gems touched my throat, I felt the weight of invisible chains. Days passed. Courtiers bowed lower, servants whispered softer. The Queen Mother's glances grew colder, her blessings shorter. Rumors reached me of generals dismissed, of loyal ministers executed for treachery that never existed. Azhar was consolidating power, one betrayal at a time. And I was his symbol of legitimacy, the bridge between his ambition and the empire's acceptance. One night, as rain lashed against the palace walls, I heard voices in the courtyard. I opened the balcony doors and peered through the mist. Azhar stood beside a cloaked man, handing him a parchment sealed with crimson wax. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw enough, the exchange of gold, the nod, the deliberate secrecy. When he came to bed hours later, he smelled faintly of smoke and rain. I pretended to sleep. He lay beside me, his breathing calm, untroubled. I stared into the dark, every exhale of his a quiet confession I could not yet prove. In that moment, I understood, the man I had married wore his kindness like armor. Beneath it was ambition sharp enough to wound the world. But I also realized something else, something that would keep me alive in the days to come. If he could play two faces, so could I. The palace had its own rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed beneath marble floors and through corridors scented with rose and betrayal. By the 3rd month, I had learned to listen to it. Every footstep carried a message, every pause in conversation a warning. The servants who once greeted me with smiles now bowed too quickly, their eyes sliding away. Even the courtyards felt altered, quieter, as if the air itself had chosen sides. I began to keep a diary. It was not for memory, but for survival. Each night, I wrote what I saw, who entered Azhar's chambers, what words were whispered behind half-closed doors, which couriers left at odd hours with sealed envelopes. At first, it was merely suspicion, but the ink soon thickened with truth. One morning, while walking near the archives, I overheard two guards talking. The Begum's father was seen near the Lahore border, one said. Not in exile, in chains. I turned the corner before they could notice me, heart pounding, breath shallow. My father, imprisoned. My dowry, stolen. My husband, silent. That night, I confronted Azhar again. Is it true? I asked quietly. My father is in Lahore, under arrest. He didn't answer immediately. He poured himself a drink, the liquid catching the lamplight like molten gold. Your father, he said finally, was found guilty of conspiracy. He sought to undermine the crown. You should be grateful his punishment was light. I stared at him. Light? You call captivity mercy? He turned to me then, his expression unreadable. You speak as though you are his daughter still. You are my wife now. Your loyalty belongs here. Something inside me broke then, not loudly, but cleanly, like the snapping of a delicate thread. I realized that love, if it had ever existed between us, was just another illusion crafted for political convenience. I left without another word, closing the heavy door behind me with more calm than I felt. In the weeks that followed, I became invisible by design. I smiled when required, spoke only when addressed, and watched everything. The Queen Mother, once cold, now avoided me altogether. Ministers who once praised my intelligence now regarded me as furniture, present but irrelevant. But that invisibility gave me freedom. I began to notice details others missed. A servant who carried messages but never food. A scribe who bowed too low each time he passed Azhar's study. A court musician whose songs changed tempo whenever the prince entered. One evening, the musician slipped a folded note beneath my goblet during dinner. I found it hours later, hidden under the edge of the carpet. The truth sleeps beneath the throne room. It sounded like a riddle. But I followed it. When the moon rose high and the corridors emptied, I took a lantern and descended the marble steps to the underground archives. There, beneath rows of ancient scrolls, I found a locked iron chest. Inside, beneath piles of decrees and tax ledgers, were letters, my father's handwriting, bound together with a silk cord. They were pleas, sent to me, never delivered. In them, he spoke of betrayal from within the royal court, of a plot to seize our family lands, and of Azhar's hand in orchestrating it. My chest tightened as I read the final line, smudged by tears or rain, do not trust the prince. Trust only the silence between his words. I fell to my knees, the lantern flickering weakly beside me. My father had known. He had tried to warn me, but Azhar had silenced him long before the wedding. Every vow he made that night had been built on deceit. I returned to my chambers before dawn, my wedding jewelry cold against my skin. As the first call to prayer echoed across the city, I made a vow of my own, not to the gods, nor to vengeance, but to truth. Azhar thought he had buried every secret beneath marble and gold. But he had forgotten the simplest rule of fire: it always begins quietly, and it always finds its way back to the surface. From that night on, I ceased being a bride. I became a listener, to whispers, to footsteps, to the softest tremor of guilt in Azhar's voice. And when I smiled at him across the breakfast table, he didn't see the change in my eyes. He didn't know the woman sitting across from him was already planning how to make the palace remember its crimes. The day it happened began like any other, serene, deceptive, golden. The palace courtyards were strewn with jasmine petals, the air thick with the scent of saffron and smoke from the morning lamps. Word had spread that the emperor himself would visit our province, and Azhar wanted every corner gleaming. Servants rushed like ants across the marble floors, polishing, decorating, pretending not to see the tension that hung over the place like an omen. I, too, played my part. I wore the rubies he had given me, the necklace that once felt like a collar but now felt like a weapon. I smiled at guests, offered blessings, bowed to elders. But beneath the silken ceremony, I carried something sharper, a letter I had written in my father's name, copied from the archives, sealed in crimson wax. A truth waiting for release. Azhar had noticed my composure lately. "You seem calmer," he remarked that morning, his tone cautious. "At peace." "I've accepted my place," I said, lowering my gaze. "Every queen must learn her limits." He smiled, satisfied. "Good," he murmured. "The Empire rewards obedience." He didn't see the faint tremor of amusement at the corner of my lips. By dusk, the palace glowed with thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played from the terraces, their songs rising like smoke into the indigo sky. Guests from distant provinces filled the halls, their laughter masking the quiet unease that only I seemed to sense. The moment arrived just after the last toast, when Azhar rose to give his speech. His words flowed smoothly, practiced like every lie before them. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate unity of blood, of loyalty, of destiny." His gaze found mine, holding it too long, as if daring me to challenge his narrative. I smiled back. "Yes," I whispered, almost to myself. "Destiny." Then I nodded to a servant standing at the far end of the hall, the same musician who had once slipped me the note. He bowed discreetly and slipped away through the side corridor. Minutes later, a commotion stirred outside. A servant ran in shouting that a lantern had fallen in the west wing, near the draperies. Azhar frowned, annoyed, but continued speaking. Another shout followed, this one closer, more urgent. And then we saw it, smoke, dark and restless, curling up through the courtyard arches like a living thing. Panic began to ripple through the hall. Guests rose, voices overlapping, the music collapsing into discord. Azhar barked orders, but the fire had already spread, too fast, too precisely. The silk banners ignited like dry leaves, the golden tapestries devoured by flame. The palace guards, confused and disoriented, struggled to contain it. I stood still amid the chaos, the heat licking closer, the reflection of the flames dancing across the jewels at my throat. For the first time in months, I felt warm, not from fear, but from release. Azhar turned toward me, shouting over the roar. "Get to safety," he commanded. I didn't move. "Safety?" I echoed. "You built no such place for me." He froze, confusion flashing into realization. "What did you do?" I took a step forward, my veil catching the orange glow. "I gave your truth back to the Empire," I said quietly. "The letters. The ledgers. Every lie you buried under this marble. By now, they're being read aloud at the Emperor's court." His expression twisted, shock, rage, disbelief all at once. "You destroyed everything." "No," I said. "I set it free." The ceiling cracked above us. Marble dust rained down like ash. I could hear the pillars groaning, the structure buckling under its own deceit. Azhar tried to reach me, but the flames surged between us, devouring the space. For an instant, his face was lit entirely in orange, beautiful, furious, afraid. Then he vanished behind the smoke. I turned away. My silk skirts brushed against the embers as I walked through the great doors and out into the open courtyard. The sky above was streaked with firelight. The music had stopped, replaced by the sound of shattering glass and distant screams. I removed the ruby necklace and dropped it onto the stones. It hissed as the heat met the gems, melting them into blood-colored drops. For the first time since my wedding day, my throat felt light. Behind me, the palace, my prison, my dowry, my inheritance, burned like a funeral pyre. And I did not look back. Because that night, I was not a widow. I was a witness. Dawn came late that morning, veiled by smoke. The once white domes of the palace stood blackened against a red sky, their gilded finials twisted and dull. The air smelled of wet ash and sandalwood, of endings and beginnings. I walked barefoot across the courtyard where the night before I had stood as a bride of empire, now only a survivor among ruins. The marble beneath my feet was still warm, whispering the memory of fire. No one called my name. The servants had fled before the flames reached the eastern wing. The guards had vanished. Even the Queen Mother, who once ruled the palace like a spirit, was gone, carried away, perhaps, by her own fear or guilt. Silence was my only companion. It was not the silence of peace, but of consequence. I found Azhar near the reflecting pool, or what remained of it, the water black, rippling faintly with falling embers. He was kneeling, soot covering his hands, his turban gone. His eyes, once proud and unreadable, were wide and raw. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked up when I approached, and I saw something in his expression I had never seen before, not anger, not love, but realization. "You think you've won," he said hoarsely. "No," I replied. "There are no winners in a fire." He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "You destroyed our legacy. Everything my family built." I cut him off gently. "Your family built its glory on deceit. And deceit burns easily." His shoulders sagged. For a heartbeat, we were simply two souls standing in the smoke of what we'd both lost: power, illusions, and the fragile dream of control. He said nothing more. When I turned to leave, he didn't stop me. Perhaps he finally understood that power cannot command forgiveness. I walked toward the gates as the sun rose behind me, its light bleeding through the haze. Villagers had gathered outside, murmuring prayers, clutching children. When they saw me, they fell silent. Some bowed. Others only stared, not with reverence, but with something deeper, almost fearful. To them, I was no longer a bride or a queen. I was the woman who had survived her own destruction. I spent the next days in the old temple across the river, a sanctuary my mother once visited. There, I washed the soot from my hair and let the wind dry it. I wrote again, though this time not of treason or revenge, but of clarity. I wrote of how easily loyalty can be traded for gold, how silence can become a weapon sharper than any sword. And how a woman, stripped of everything, can still find her voice among ashes. Messengers arrived from the emperor's court 3 days later. They came not to punish me, but to listen. The truth I had sent, the letters, the ledgers, had reached Delhi before the fire did. The emperor had read them aloud before his ministers. Azhar's holdings were seized, his title revoked, his crimes recorded in ink that would outlast us both. The lands once stolen from my family were restored, though I no longer cared to return. When the messengers asked where I would go, I said only, where silence allows me to breathe. They left offerings of gold and silks, but I took none. Wealth had already shown me its curse. Months passed, and the palace became a ruin overgrown with vines. Travelers whispered of it, the place where a queen burned her own wedding hall to reveal the truth. Some called me vengeful, others saintly. I was neither. I was simply awake. Sometimes, at twilight, I returned to the riverbank and watched the reflection of those blackened domes in the water. The wind carries faint echoes of drums, as if some part of that wedding night still lingers, circling endlessly through time. And in those moments, I almost pity Azhar, not for his fall, but for his blindness. He had believed fire was an end. I had learned it was only a beginning. They say history forgets women like me, that we fade between the lines written by men who call themselves kings. But I left my mark where even time cannot wash it away, in the silence after the flames, in the stories whispered by those who still walk these lands. I was not the bride who watched her palace burn. I was the woman who walked away, barefoot, unbroken, carrying truth like a flame that refused to die. And somewhere, in the ashes, my mother's spirit smiled.